Ladies and gentlemen, friends, seekers of understanding, thank you for joining me today. I want to begin with an observation that is at once obvious and profoundly unsettling. Depression is part of the human condition. It is not merely a clinical diagnosis or a label in a psychiatric manual. It is an experience that can infiltrate the very machinery of our minds. It shapes the way we think, the decisions we make, and the narratives we construct about our lives. We might imagine that depression is something external, like a storm that passes over us, but in truth, it is often an internal phenomenon, a pattern emerging from the interplay of thought, biology, and environment. To comprehend it fully, we must examine it both scientifically and philosophically, recognizing the mechanisms in our minds as well as the meaning we assign to our experiences. Many people tend to view depression as a single, monolithic experience, as though it were one uniform shade of sadness that all humans share. But the mind, as we know from cognitive science, is a complex, evolved system, and its affective states are correspondingly intricate. There are varieties of depressive experience, each arising from different causes, and each demanding a different response. Some forms of depression stem from the stories we tell ourselves about the meaning of life, while others emerge from events that overwhelm our sense of control. Still others arise from patterns of thought that trap us in loops of negativity. If we wish to navigate these mental landscapes successfully, we must begin by recognizing their diversity. It is helpful, I think, to conceive of the mind as a kind of ecosystem, a network of interacting agents, each generating its own signals and behaviors. Within this ecosystem, depressive states can arise almost like ecological imbalances, where some mental processes overpower others, creating feedback loops that reinforce despair. Just as a biologist studies both the organism and its environment, so too must we study both the mind and the context in which it operates. We need to see how thoughts, emotions, and perceptions interact, and how environmental factors, social, cultural, and physical, can exacerbate or alleviate depressive tendencies. This perspective allows us to appreciate depression not as an inescapable fate, but as a dynamic system that can be influenced and understood. Today, I wish to focus on 5 types of depression, each representative of common ways in which human beings can become trapped in their own mental landscapes. I call these types existential, situational, cognitive social, and learned helplessness depressions. Each type has distinctive triggers, patterns, and consequences, and each offers opportunities for intervention if we approach it thoughtfully. Recognizing the type of depression we are encountering is crucial because it determines the strategies we might employ to recover and flourish. The mind does not respond to generic solutions. It responds to interventions that are precisely tailored to the source of imbalance within the system. But simply knowing the type is not enough. We must also understand the deeper principles that underlie our mental processes. And this is where philosophy intersects with cognitive science. By examining the mechanisms that generate depressive thoughts, our narrative constructions, our predictive models of the world, our tendencies to ruminate, we can begin to disentangle the patterns that perpetuate despair. Philosophy, after all, trains us to reflect fully on the nature of our experiences, to ask what they mean, and to distinguish between what is real and what is merely a mental simulation of reality. Science provides the empirical grounding, philosophy provides a conceptual framework. Together, they equip us with the tools to intervene thoughtfully in our own mental ecosystems. Equally important is the recognition that depression is not merely a problem to be solved, but a signal to be interpreted. It communicates in its own way the limitations, vulnerabilities, and neglected dimensions of our lives. Ignoring it or attempting to suppress it without understanding risks compounding the problem. But attending to it with curiosity, analysis, and deliberate action transforms depression into a teacher, a guide pointing toward areas of our lives in need of attention, repair, and adaptation. It is a challenge to develop the reflective capacities necessary to respond rather than react to our internal signals. Thus, our task today is both descriptive and prescriptive. We will explore the 5 types of depression, tracing the conditions under which they arise, the dynamics that sustain them, and the practical strategies for avoiding their pitfalls. We will approach the subject with a balance of rigor and compassion, seeking to illuminate both the machinery and the meaning of our mental lives. If we succeed, the audience will not only gain a clearer understanding of depression as a multifaceted phenomenon, but also acquire actionable insights for cultivating resilience, agency, and flourishing in their own minds. The mind is not a passive vessel, it is an instrument of understanding, and when we learn to use it wisely, we can navigate the dark valleys of depression and emerge into clarity and purpose. Before we can discuss how to avoid these mental states, it is crucial to recognize them in all their subtlety and variety. Depression is not a singular, uniform phenomenon. It manifests in different patterns, each with its own triggers and dynamics. Our minds are not passive containers, but active processors, continuously interpreting signals from both the external world and the internal narrative we maintain about ourselves. By identifying the form that a depressive state takes, we gain the conceptual leverage needed to intervene. Awareness, in this context, functions as both a diagnostic tool and a form of mental empowerment, allowing us to see not only the presence of despair, but also the mechanisms sustaining it. This is the first step toward mastery over our emotional landscape. Existential depression arises from deep, reflective questioning about life's meaning or its apparent lack thereof. It is the kind of despair that philosophers and poets have wrestled with for millennia, confrontation with the void that can feel overwhelming. Cognitive science illuminates the machinery behind this state. Our brains are evolved to detect patterns and construct narratives. When these narratives collapse, when coherence seems impossible, despair follows naturally. Yet this type of depression is also an opportunity for insight. By recognizing the mind's penchant for meaning-making, we can actively engage in reconstructing the stories we tell ourselves, transforming a potentially paralyzing void into a canvas for creative and reflective life projects. Situational depression, by contrast, is triggered by external events, loss, failure, or sudden hardship. Unlike existential despair, it emerges from circumstances rather than abstract reflection. Still, the severity of this form of depression depends heavily on interpretation. Cognitive psychology demonstrates that two individuals can experience identical events yet respond in entirely different ways. The mind interprets and predicts, creating feedback loops that either exacerbate despair or support resilience. Here, understanding the causal chain between event, perception, and emotional response is vital. Awareness of these chains allows us to interrupt maladaptive patterns, introducing interventions that restore a sense of agency and control over our mental states. Cognitive depression is a state in which the mind becomes its own adversary, trapped in loops of rumination, negative self-talk, and distorted thinking. Our predictive and interpretive faculties, normally our allies, become instruments of self-defeat. Philosophically, this is a fascinating instance of the mind reflecting upon itself, yet failing to recognize the constructed nature of its interpretations. Interventions here must focus on metacognition, stepping back from one's thoughts, evaluating their accuracy, and learning to distinguish between mere mental activity and reliable representation. With deliberate practice, the loops of maladaptive cognition can be broken, allowing the mind to regain its natural orientation toward problem, solving and adaptive action. Social depression emerges from isolation, loneliness, and the perception that one is misunderstood or disconnected from others. Humans are deeply social creatures. Our cognitive architecture evolved in cooperative communities. When social bonds weaken, the mind experiences a form of deprivation that manifests as emotional distress. Addressing this form of depression requires engaging with others authentically, cultivating relationships, and participating in communities that provide recognition and shared purpose. Here, the tools are both practical and philosophical. Understanding that others have minds as rich and complex as our own fosters empathy, which in turn strengthens connections. Connection is not merely a comfort, it is a necessity for the cognitive and emotional health of our species. Learned helplessness depression represents a particularly insidious form of despair when repeated failures lead to the conclusion that action is futile. The mind may adopt passivity as a default strategy. This state is supported by the brain's natural predictive machinery, which updates expectations based on prior outcomes. The challenge is to reintroduce evidence of efficacy into the system through small, achievable actions. Philosophy informs us here as well by viewing life experimentally. We see that failures are not verdicts, but data. Understanding the principles of adaptation and incremental learning allows us to cultivate resilience, restoring the sense that our actions matter and that agency is real, even in challenging circumstances. Taken together, these 5 types of depression provide a framework for understanding the diversity of human despair. Each has distinct causes, dynamics, and potential interventions, yet all share a common feature. They are neither fixed nor inevitable. Our minds are complex, adaptive systems capable of learning, reflection, and self-modification. By cultivating awareness, metacognition, social engagement, and narrative reconstruction, we equip ourselves to recognize early signs of depressive states and to apply targeted strategies that restore balance and agency. Recognizing the type of depression is the doorway to resilience. In approaching these states, it is essential to combine empirical insight with philosophical reflection. Science tells us the how of depression, the mechanisms, patterns, and brain processes involved, while philosophy provides the why and what next. The frameworks for meaning, narrative, and intentional action. By integrating these perspectives, we are not merely surviving depressive episodes, but actively reshaping the architecture of our minds. We learn to interpret signals, to distinguish between meaningful distress and mental noise, and to cultivate habits that prevent descent into despair. This dual approach equips us to navigate the landscape of depression with both understanding and efficacy. Existential depression is, in a sense, the most philosophical of all forms of despair. It emerges when we confront questions so large and pervasive that they threaten the very coherence of our inner world. What is the point of our existence? Does life have meaning, or are we simply ephemeral configurations of matter temporarily aware of themselves? These questions, when approached with unflinching seriousness, can produce a sense of vertigo, as if one is peering into an abyss. The mind, evolved to detect patterns and construct coherent narratives, struggles when it finds none. The absence of meaning is experienced not merely cognitively, but effectively, producing a profound sense of emptiness that can feel inescapable. From the perspective of cognitive science, this form of depression is a natural byproduct of the brain's design. Our minds are prediction engines, constantly generating expectations and seeking coherence. Evolution has endowed us with the capacity to imagine possibilities, to construct stories, and to reflect on our own existence. Yet this very capacity makes us vulnerable when the narrative threads unravel. When the coherence of our life story is disrupted or feels arbitrary, despair arises. Philosophy and science converge here. Understanding the mechanisms of thought can illuminate why the sense of purposelessness feels so compelling, while philosophical reflection provides tools to reinterpret or reconstruct the story. One of the key insights in addressing existential depression is the recognition that meaning is constructed, not discovered. Meaning is not a pre-existing entity hidden in the fabric of the universe awaiting our discovery. It is the product of our cognitive and cultural capacities, a pattern we impose on experience. This realization is liberating because it shifts the locus of control from an external, immutable source to our own creative faculties. Life need not have a preordained purpose to be significant. Significance arises from engagement, reflection, and intentional action. Recognizing that we are authors of meaning allows us to participate actively in the creation of our inner worlds. Another tool for resilience is what I term narrative repair. The stories we tell ourselves about our lives shape our emotions and perceptions, and when these stories fracture, depression can follow. Narrative repair involves writing, reflecting, or discussing one's experiences with a view to coherence and continuity. It is an act of cognitive craftsmanship, selecting which elements of one's life to foreground, which interpretations to emphasize, and which connections to weave together. By reconstructing the narrative in a way that aligns with our values and aspirations, we reshape not only our self-understanding, but also the emotional patterns that accompany it. Equally important is the practice of what I call philosophical mindfulness. This is the habit of observing one's thoughts and emotions as objects of reflection rather than commands that must be obeyed. Existential despair often arises when we mistake the raw output of our minds for inevitable reality. By cultivating the ability to notice and examine these mental phenomena without being enslaved by them, we gain a measure of distance and freedom. Thoughts become data points rather than dictates. Despair is a signal to be interpreted rather than a decree to be obeyed. This observational stance reduces the immediate power of existential anxiety. The combination of narrative repair and philosophical mindfulness provides a dual strategy, one constructive, the other reflective. Narrative repair actively reshapes the content of our life story, creating coherence where it was absent. Philosophical mindfulness, in contrast, trains the metacognitive muscles, enabling us to observe and modulate our emotional responses to that story. Together, these approaches allow the mind to regain stability and resilience. Existential despair is not an external force pressing upon us. It is an internal pattern that can be understood, interpreted, and transformed through deliberate thought and practice. Ultimately, existential depression challenges us to confront the void, but it need not imprison us. By understanding that meaning is constructed, actively repairing our narratives and cultivating philosophical mindfulness, we reclaim agency over our inner experience. We learn to treat despair not as a verdict on reality, but as a signal, a prompt for reflection and creative engagement. In this way, the abyss becomes not a destination, but a landscape to navigate, a space in which thoughtful, intentional living can produce significance, coherence, and ultimately, resilience in the face of life's profound uncertainties. Situational depression is the form most familiar to many of us, arising from the tangible challenges and setbacks that life inevitably delivers. Bereavement, job loss, personal betrayal, these events can shake the foundations of our daily existence. Yet cognitive psychology teaches us that it is rarely the events themselves that determine the depth of our despair. Rather, it is the interpretations we construct around them. Two individuals may encounter the same loss, but their internal narratives, the stories they tell themselves about what happened and what it means, can lead one toward resilience and the other toward hopelessness. Understanding this distinction is the first step in regaining agency over our emotional lives. The human mind operates as a complex interpretive system, constantly generating predictions and explanations for the events we encounter. In situational depression, these interpretive faculties can turn against us. When setbacks are interpreted as evidence of personal inadequacy or inevitability of failure, emotional despair is reinforced. Conversely, when we adopt a perspective that sees challenges as contingent, navigable, and meaningful, even painful events can become opportunities for learning and growth. Here, the philosophical dimension is essential. The way we frame experience shapes its felt reality. The narrative we adopt is not trivial. It is the lens through which life itself is perceived. One of the most effective tools for countering situational depression is cognitive flexibility. This involves training ourselves to entertain multiple perspectives on the same circumstance, to question the initial, often negative interpretations that arise spontaneously. Cognitive flexibility allows us to see that setbacks are not universal truths, but context-dependent phenomena. By considering alternative explanations and potential outcomes, the mind can escape the trap of rigid, self-reinforcing narratives. Flexibility is not mere wishful thinking. It is a disciplined cognitive strategy grounded in both psychology and practical reasoning that opens the door to adaptive responses. Equally crucial is the practice of active coping, which entails focusing on actionable steps rather than ruminating on perceived helplessness. Depression often arises when individuals feel trapped, perceiving problems as insurmountable. By identifying even modest interventions, tasks that can be accomplished, decisions that can be made, problems that can be approached incrementally, the mind shifts from passive rumination to purposeful engagement. Active coping restores a sense of agency, counteracting the perception of futility that situational depression exploits. Action, even small, is both a psychological and practical antidote to despair. Another powerful strategy is the cultivation of gratitude and attention to small victories. When the larger narrative of life seems bleak, focusing on tangible, positive experiences, however minor, can recalibrate mood and perspective. Gratitude is not merely sentiment. It functions as a cognitive tool, directing attention toward evidence of support, accomplishment, and value. Small wins accumulate into patterns of reinforcement, helping the mind recognize that not all is lost, that progress is possible, and that the present moment contains elements worth acknowledging. In combination with cognitive flexibility and active coping, gratitude provides a stabilizing counterweight to situational despair. From a Dennettian standpoint, it is essential to recognize that our minds are ecosystems of competing, intentional stances. These stances, patterns of expectation, interpretation, and attention, compete to shape our perception of events. By deliberately adopting a stance that emphasizes adaptability, agency, and constructive engagement, we alter not only our interpretation of life's challenges, but also our emotional response to them. In this sense, situational depression is not a fixed state, but a dynamic interaction among perception, cognition, and action and interaction that can be steered through deliberate reflection and practice. Ultimately, situational depression reminds us that life's external events, while sometimes painful, need not determine our inner landscape. By developing cognitive flexibility, engaging in active coping, and cultivating gratitude for small victories, we exercise the mind's capacity for adaptation and resilience. The narrative framework we construct, the stances we adopt, and the actions we pursue coalesce into a cognitive ecosystem capable of withstanding adversity. In doing so, we transform temporary setbacks from sources of despair into opportunities for insight, growth, and renewed agency, navigating life's challenges with both rigor and intentionality. Cognitive depression is a particularly insidious form of despair because it originates not from the external world, but from the very machinery of our minds. Rumination, catastrophic thinking, and persistent self-criticism create feedback loops that reinforce negative emotional states. Unlike situational depression, where external events trigger sadness, cognitive depression is self-generated. The mind becomes both the architect and the prison of despair. Philosophically, this presents a fascinating paradox. The very organ that allows us to reason, reflect, and solve problems can also become a source of suffering. Recognizing this duality is the first step toward reclaiming agency and intervening in the patterns of thought that perpetuate depressive states. Our brains, as cognitive science reveals, are essentially prediction engines. They continuously model the environment, anticipate outcomes, and guide our behavior based on probabilistic forecasts. In cognitive depression, these predictive mechanisms become skewed, favoring negative interpretations, overestimations of risk, and undervaluing of competence. Feedback loops intensify these distortions, making the mind prone to chronic pessimism. Philosophically, this demonstrates the interplay between mechanism and meaning. The architecture of thought produces certain experiential realities, and understanding the mechanics of cognition can illuminate why the mind sometimes deceives itself into despair. One of the most effective strategies for addressing cognitive depression is metacognition, the practice of observing one's thoughts as objects rather than commands. By cultivating awareness of the mind's internal chatter We can distinguish between genuine evidence and the distortions of rumination. Thoughts are treated not as mandates, but as signals to be interpreted critically. This practice creates a necessary psychological distance, allowing us to examine negative predictions and catastrophic interpretations without being compelled to act on them. Philosophically, it is an exercise in self-observation that leverages the mind's reflective capacities to regain control over its own outputs. Complementing metacognition is cognitive restructuring, a process by which negative thoughts are challenged and replaced with more balanced interpretations. When the mind generates catastrophic predictions, we can interrogate their validity. Are they supported by evidence? Are they overly generalized? By systematically evaluating and revising the content of our thinking, we reshape the patterns that perpetuate depressive states. Cognitive restructuring is not mere optimism. It is the deliberate correction of predictive errors in the mental machinery. Over time, these interventions recalibrate the mind's habitual interpretations, producing a more accurate and resilient mental landscape. Another crucial tool is behavioral activation, which involves taking deliberate, structured action, even when motivation is low. Cognitive depression often diminishes the will to act, reinforcing feelings of helplessness. Behavioral activation interrupts this cycle by introducing external evidence that counters negative predictions, completing tasks, engaging socially, and participating in meaningful activities. These actions provide feedback to the predictive system, demonstrating competence and restoring a sense of efficacy. Even small steps can have disproportionate effects, gradually rewiring both thought patterns and mood through concrete engagement with the world. The intersection of science and philosophy is particularly evident in the management of cognitive depression. Understanding the neural and cognitive mechanisms allows us to see how loops of negative thought arise, while philosophical reflection gives us tools to interpret, contextualize, and modulate those experiences. In Dennettian terms, we treat the mind as an ecosystem of interacting agents, some of which are prone to pessimistic patterns. By monitoring, intervening, and restructuring, we act as stewards of our cognitive ecosystem, guiding it toward patterns that support well-being rather than despair. Ultimately, cognitive depression is both a challenge and an opportunity. It reveals the mind's capacity to create complex internal realities and demonstrates that mastery over thought is neither trivial nor impossible. By practicing metacognition, employing cognitive restructuring, and engaging in behavioral activation, we gain control over the very processes that once entrapped us. Science explains the machinery, philosophy illuminates the meaning, and practical interventions provide pathways to resilience. The mind, once recognized as both source of suffering and instrument of insight, becomes a tool for recovery, growth, and renewed agency in the face of its own shadows. Humans are inherently social creatures, and this truth is deeply embedded in the architecture of our minds. From an evolutionary perspective, our cognitive capacities were shaped in the context of tightly knit communities where cooperation, communication, and mutual support were essential for survival. Isolation, therefore, is experienced not merely as the absence of social contact, but as a profound threat to cognitive and emotional well-being. Social depression arises when we perceive ourselves as disconnected, unseen, or unsupported, producing a pervasive sense of alienation. This state reminds us that our mental machinery is fundamentally relational. Our emotions, thoughts, and sense of purpose are intertwined with our engagement with others. The mechanisms of social depression are subtle and insidious. Loneliness amplifies negative interpretations, reinforces rumination, and can create self-reinforcing feedback loops of despair. When one withdraws from social interaction, the mind lacks the counterbalancing input of alternative perspectives, empathy, and validation. Without these, internal narratives can become distorted, emphasizing personal shortcomings and exaggerating feelings of inadequacy. In this sense, social depression is both a cognitive and relational phenomenon. It is produced by internal thought patterns, but sustained by a lack of external connection. Understanding this duality is crucial for intervention. One effective strategy is to foster authentic connection, actively reaching out, sharing experiences, and listening deeply to others. Superficial interactions are insufficient. The mind requires genuine engagement where thoughts and emotions are recognized and reciprocated. Social bonds function not only as comfort, but as cognitive scaffolds, shaping our narratives and modulating our affective responses. Philosophically, this approach aligns with the idea that minds do not exist in isolation. Understanding ourselves requires engagement with other minds. Connection, therefore, is both a psychological necessity and an existential practice, reinforcing resilience and countering the internal logic of social depression. Participation in community or collective projects is another powerful antidote. When we contribute to something larger than ourselves, we experience purpose, agency, and interdependence. These activities generate feedback loops of competence and belonging, counteracting the sense of futility that often accompanies social isolation. From a Dennettian perspective, the mind thrives when it is embedded in networks of shared intentionality where goals, narratives, and actions converge across individuals. By engaging with collective projects, we expand our cognitive and emotional ecosystem, creating patterns of reinforcement that strengthen both self-esteem and social integration. Reflecting on theory of mind insights can further reduce alienation. Recognizing that others possess minds as rich, complex, and nuanced as our own cultivates empathy, understanding, and perspective taking. This awareness diminishes the misperception that we are alone in our struggles or that our experiences are uniquely misunderstood. It allows the mind to anticipate and interpret social responses with greater accuracy, reducing anxiety and fostering adaptive engagement. In practical terms, empathy becomes a cognitive tool, restructuring the internal narrative to emphasize shared experience and relational possibility. It is also important to remember that isolation is often an illusion, not a fixed reality. Our perceptions of being disconnected can exaggerate the degree of separation, reinforcing depressive states. Seeking is not a sign of weakness, it's an exercise in rational self-care. It aligns with both our biological predispositions and our cognitive needs. By deliberately engaging in social activity, fostering authentic interactions, and participating in collective projects, we disrupt the patterns that sustain social depression, replacing them with reinforcing experiences that restore both agency and belonging. Ultimately, social depression illustrates the deeply interdependent nature of human cognition. Our minds are not self-contained vessels. They are relational ecosystems, responsive to the presence and quality of connections with others. By cultivating authentic relationships, engaging with communities, And understanding the perspectives of others, we provide our minds with the necessary scaffolding for resilience. Social depression can be mitigated not only through internal reflection, but through intentional engagement with the external social world, transforming perceived isolation into a landscape of connection, empathy, and meaningful interaction. Learned helplessness, depression, is one of the most insidious forms of despair, not because it originates from extraordinary events, but because it convinces the mind that effort is futile. Behavioral psychology describes it as a response pattern emerging from repeated failures or perceived lack of control over outcomes. When attempts to influence circumstances consistently fail, the mind generalizes this experience, creating a default expectation that action is useless. This expectation can spread across domains of life, producing pervasive inertia and a sense of resignation. Unlike situational depression, which is tied to specific events, learned helplessness becomes a generalized cognitive posture, undermining initiative and amplifying despair, even when opportunities for success exist. The danger of this state is that it often prevents engagement before the possibility of achievement has been tested. The mind prematurely abandons attempts at influence, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. It interprets the absence of results not as a consequence of specific circumstances, but as evidence of personal incapacity. Philosophically, this illustrates the way the brain constructs models of reality, sometimes overgeneralizing based on limited data. Recognition of this pattern is the first step toward liberation. Understanding that the sense of futility is a learned inference, not an absolute truth, allows us to begin rebuilding agency incrementally. A practical antidote is to start with small, achievable actions. Even modest successes provide evidence against the mind's assumption of impotence, recalibrating expectations and reinforcing the capacity for control. These incremental wins act like cognitive reinforcements, signaling to the brain that effort can produce meaningful results. Over time, this accumulation of evidence disrupts the generalized pattern of helplessness, fostering confidence and restoring initiative. The principle is simple yet powerful. Action precedes belief, and the mind adapts to the feedback provided by tangible engagement with the world. Another essential approach is treating life as an experimental laboratory, embracing failure as data rather than verdicts. Each unsuccessful attempt conveys information about strategy, context, and circumstance. It need not serve as a moral judgment on personal ability. By reframing failure as information, the mind escapes the rigidity of learned helplessness, allowing for iterative problem solving and adaptive planning. Dennett often emphasizes that human cognition is akin to algorithmic processing. Multiple strategies can be attempted, refined, and combined, producing successful outcomes even where initial efforts fail. Life, then, is a sequence of experiments, and our responses should reflect curiosity rather than surrender. Reflection on evolutionary and cultural resilience provides additional perspective. Humanity has persisted through challenges vastly more severe than the difficulties we typically face today: famine, predation, social upheaval, and environmental catastrophe. Our cognitive and emotional systems are products of these pressures, evolved to endure adversity and adapt to changing circumstances. Recognizing this heritage can counteract the sense of helplessness by situating our struggles within a broader narrative of resilience. The mind is capable of recalibration, and what feels insurmountable in isolation is often negotiable when approached with adaptive strategies and historical perspective. Cognitive and philosophical insights converge in understanding learned helplessness. Just as computers can iterate over multiple algorithms to find solutions, human minds can attempt various strategies for living. When one approach fails, another may succeed. Viewing life as a system of possibilities rather than a series of judgments transforms despair into experimentation. This Dennettian perspective emphasizes that agency is cumulative, learned through interaction with the environment, reflection on outcomes, and iterative adaptation. Our cognitive architecture is inherently capable of generating success, even after repeated setbacks, provided we maintain engagement and deliberate experimentation. Ultimately, breaking the cycle of learned helplessness requires patience, intentionality, and an understanding of the mind's adaptive capacities. Small, achievable actions rebuild agency. Experimental framing transforms failures into insights, and awareness of human resilience grounds us in perspective. By combining these approaches with iterative, algorithmic problem solving, we reclaim control over the patterns that once immobilized us. Learned helplessness is not a fixed state, but a temporary configuration of the cognitive ecosystem, one that can be dismantled and replaced with a dynamic, resilient orientation toward life's challenges, restoring both initiative and hope across the various forms of depression: existential, situational, cognitive, social, and learned helplessness. Certain strategies repeatedly prove effective. These are not one-size-fits-all solutions, nor are they quick fixes, but they operate on principles that address both the mechanisms and the meanings of depressive experience. The first of these is mindfulness and self-awareness, the practice of observing thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations without immediately identifying with them. By creating a space between stimulus and reaction, the mind can disengage from automatic patterns of rumination or despair, transforming what might feel like an overwhelming flood of experience into manageable, analyzable data. Mindfulness alone is insufficient if the mind remains rigid in its interpretations. That is why cognitive flexibility is essential. The ability to entertain multiple perspectives, to question initial assumptions, and to revise beliefs in response to new information allows the brain to escape self-reinforcing loops of negativity. Cognitive flexibility is not mere optimism. It is the disciplined application of the mind's predictive machinery to counteract overgeneralization, exaggeration, and faulty inferences. It is a meta-level strategy teaching the mind to observe and adjust its own interpretive tendencies rather than being enslaved by them. Another universal tool is incremental action, the recognition that even small, deliberate steps can accumulate into profound change. Depression often immobilizes by amplifying the sense of futility or the impossibility of action. By breaking challenges into manageable units and pursuing them deliberately, the mind receives concrete feedback. Small victories recalibrate expectations, increase agency, and provide evidence that effort can influence outcomes. In this way, action itself becomes both a cognitive corrective and an emotional stabilizer, bridging the gap between intention and experience. Narrative reconstruction is particularly relevant across all forms of depression, especially existential and cognitive types. Our minds are storytellers, continuously weaving experiences into coherent narratives. When these narratives fracture, despair follows. By deliberately editing our life stories, highlighting achievements, reframing setbacks, and integrating challenges as learning experiences, we can restore coherence and meaning. Narrative reconstruction is not self-deception. It is the conscious exercise of the mind's natural tendency to generate interpretations, producing stories that support resilience, agency, and purposeful engagement with the world. Social support, too, is a foundational tool. Community and connection leverage the inherently relational nature of human cognition. Humans are designed to flourish in social networks where ideas, empathy, and feedback circulate. Isolation amplifies depressive patterns, whereas engagement with others provides perspective, validation, and emotional reinforcement. Participation in meaningful relationships or collective projects not only supports its emotional well-being, but also scaffolds cognitive processes, reinforcing adaptive interpretations and creating environments where the mind can regain balance and stability. These strategies are complementary rather than mutually exclusive. Mindfulness allows observation. Cognitive flexibility permits reinterpretation. Incremental action demonstrates efficacy. Narrative reconstruction restores meaning. And community provides relational scaffolding. Together, they form an integrated approach, addressing both the internal mechanics of thought and the existential significance that underpins depressive experience. Each tool amplifies the effects of the others, producing a synergistic effect that enhances resilience and capacity for engagement with life challenges. It is crucial to recognize that these tools are not magical remedies. They require consistent practice, reflection, and adaptation. Depression is not simply a flaw in character or willpower. It is a pattern of mental activity shaped by biological, cognitive, and social factors. By applying these strategies thoughtfully, we intervene at multiple levels. We influence the neural and cognitive machinery, reshape the interpretive narratives of our lives, and cultivate social and emotional environments that support flourishing. In this integration of philosophy and science, the mind becomes both aware and active, capable of recovering from and even thriving beyond depressive episodes. In closing, let us step back and consider what we have explored. Depression, in its many manifestations, is not merely a condition to be endured or a disease to be eradicated. It is both a signal and a challenge, a complex communication from the mind that something in our internal patterns or external circumstances requires attention. It draws our awareness to vulnerabilities, to distorted thinking, to neglected relationships, or to the absence of coherent meaning. By approaching depression as an intelligible phenomenon rather than an arbitrary affliction, we gain the capacity to respond thoughtfully with strategies informed by both empirical science and philosophical reflection. The first principle in cultivating resilience is recognition. We must identify the type of depression we are experiencing. Existential, situational, cognitive, social, or learned helplessness. Recognition is not labeling for the sake of judgment, but understanding for the sake of intervention. Each type has its own dynamics, triggers, and feedback loops, and misidentifying the pattern can lead to ineffective responses or further despair. By observing the mind carefully, as a scientist might observe a complex system, we gain actionable insight into the forces that shape our affective landscape and can begin to respond with deliberate, informed strategies. Next comes philosophical reflection, an exercise in examining the assumptions, narratives, and interpretations that shape our experience. Science provides the descriptive tools, the mechanisms, patterns, and feedback loops, while philosophy provides the interpretive lens, illuminating questions of meaning, purpose, and agency. Together, they form a powerful framework for understanding both the causes and consequences of depression. Reflection allows us to step back from the immediacy of suffering, to interrogate our mental models, and to cultivate awareness that thought, feeling, and action are interconnected and malleable. Equally important is deliberate action. Awareness and understanding alone are insufficient if they do not translate into concrete engagement with the world. We reshape our thoughts through metacognition and cognitive restructuring, rebuild agency through incremental action, and restore social and relational balance by cultivating connection. Action in this context is not random or reactive. It is informed, purposeful, and iterative. It is the bridge between knowledge and experience, between understanding our vulnerabilities and actualizing our capacity to thrive. To navigate these challenges effectively, we must become the competent, reflective architects of our own minds. Like philosophers and cognitive scientists, we examine, experiment, and adapt. Life presents losses, obstacles, and episodes that seem devoid of meaning, yet each presents an opportunity for growth. By observing patterns, testing interventions, and revising our internal narratives, we exert influence over our own cognitive and emotional ecosystems. The mind is neither passive nor predetermined. It is a system capable of learning, self-correction, and intentional transformation. It is crucial to recognize that despair is not destiny. Your mind is not a prisoner of circumstance, but an instrument capable of creativity, understanding, and resilience. By cultivating mindfulness, employing cognitive flexibility, practicing behavioral activation, reconstructing narratives, and nurturing social bonds, you transform the mind from a site of entrapment into a laboratory for flourishing. These strategies are iterative, cumulative, and synergistic. Their power lies in their consistent application and in the reflective stance they encourage toward life and experience. Ultimately, the promise is profound but accessible with careful attention, awareness, and deliberate engagement. The mind can not only survive depressive states, but thrive despite them. Depression is neither an endpoint nor an indictment. It is a prompt for reflection, adaptation, and growth. By integrating scientific understanding with philosophical insight, by acting purposefully, and by nurturing our cognitive and social capacities, we emerge stronger, wiser, and more capable of living meaningful lives. Thank you for your attention and for the commitment to approaching your mind with curiosity, care, and intentionality.